Thank you for downloading this edition of Radio 4's Start the Week, presented by me, Stephanie Flanders.
Hello. There are circumstances in which the pursuit of a virtuous life can seem like a luxury. The small band of human survivors who've made it through to the final volume of Margaret Atwood's dystopian trilogy about a plague-blasted world simply want to stay safely clear of the pigoons and the paintballers. But even they can't suppress the old human instincts for love and friendship and the altruism that comes with them. Do their associates really count as friends, though, in a world where you don't get much choice about who you spend time with if you want to stay alive? The writer A.C Grayling may have a view on this. He's just about to publish an exploration of our ideas of friendship across the century, the first in a new series of monographs on vices and virtues. And Vicky Featherstone, the new artistic director of the Royal Court Theatre in London, has also been thinking about the obligations and burdens of friendship as she works on her first production for the Royal Court, a moral fable about the rewards of ruthlessness and the hazards of ruth. Dennis Kelly's The Ritual Slaughter of George Mastromas. We start, though, with Margaret Atwood, a writer who's always been thrillingly indifferent to the conventional fence lines of literary form and genre. She's written poetry, novels, historical essays, online collaborative fiction, librettos. She's even embraced that newest kind of short-form publication, the tweet. But she's surely best known for her novels, from The Handmaid's Tale and the Booker-winning The Blind Assassin to her latest book, Mad Adam, the last of a trilogy about a post-apocalyptic world populated by genetic chimeras. Margaret Atwood, when you wrote the first of that trilogy, Oryx and Crepe, did you know how long you were going to stay in the world that you'd created?
No idea.
So
no,
what was it? Why did you not get the exit visa after the first book?
Well, the first one ends on an open-ended cliffhanger, at which point we hope the reader will think, well, what would I do? Would I shoot the remaining human beings as hazardous aggressors, or would I make friends with them? Would I offer them friendship? Would they reciprocate? And we actually don't know the answer to that. So I did want to know the answer, and in order to do that, of course, I had to write 2 more books.
You had to write 2 more. Why 2?
Well, there were 2 stories. And the one in the second book follows a group of pacifist, vegetarian, unless you're really hungry, religious cultists cultivating vegetables and raising bees on rooftops in slums, and what happens to them. The third book follows the more resistance-prone group of mad Adamites, named after originally an online game called Extinctathon, which is run by a grandmaster called Mad Adam. Adam named the animals, Mad Adam names the dead ones want to play. So who was this person? We find out, and we also find out about his group of bioresistance activists and what happens to all of them when they find themselves together, the plague having swept away quite a bit of humanity, but leaving the genetically modified, very good-looking but innocent Quakers.
And a handful of ungenetically modified
handful
humans.
Of ungenetically modified humans, which would include the original Jimmy the Snowman, shepherd of the Quakers, the remnants of the God's Gardeners, and the Mad Adamites now assembled.
I want to ask you a question which you've been asked a lot, and you're probably bored of answering it, but I think people who haven't heard the answer will be interested in it. You have made the distinction between science fiction and speculative fiction. That was misunderstood at one point, as though you were looking down on science fiction, which I don't think is true, but you very firmly say this is speculative fiction. What's the difference in your mind?
It's just a question of what label is on the box. So we could call them A and B rather than these other 2 terms, or we could call them, apples and oranges. But there is a difference between a story set in a galaxy far, far away and in another time, and a story set on our planet that could conceivably happen because we've got all the tools for it. And I think our approach to those stories as readers is quite different. If I want total escape, I go off to see Star Wars. I may find out some things about human nature because you can't make a narrative story. As a human being, you cannot make a story without saying things about human nature, even if your protagonists are rabbits. But I think there is a difference if you know it might actually be possible. So 1984, let's call that a garet. War of the Worlds, let's call that a tomato.
Yes, I mean, it's kind of extrapolative fiction, isn't it? You're following a road into the future and kind of building it out.
If you don't like this road, don't go down it, more or less like that.
And just to extend that, a lot of dystopian fictions are no-entry signs. They're a kind of no-entry sign. They say, don't go here. In a way, maybe The Handmaid's Tale was a bit like that.
Why would you want to go there?
Yeah, well, exactly. I felt a bit different about this trilogy. It's less a warning, and it's more ambiguous.
You mean you were tempted?
Well, there are elements
you might
in it.
like to dress up in bed sheets and...
Well, there's as you say yourself, there's always a utopia hiding away inside a dystopia.
Yes, there's always... Each dystopia contains a little utopia, and certainly each utopia conceals a hidden dystopia. So those two forms are joined at the hip, and they're the yin and yang of each other. And there are some pluses to a world with a lot fewer human beings in it.
Your Krakers are genetically engineered to be good, I suppose you would say.
They're genetically engineered to avoid all of the problems that come to us because we're not composed that way. For instance, they're not only vegetarian, but they can eat leaves like rabbits. There is a side effect to that, but we won't go into it here. And therefore, they will never have to have agriculture. They don't eat animals, therefore they will never have the problems of factory farming. They don't have to wear clothing. In fact, they find the whole idea of clothing pretty puzzling. They've got built-in sunblock and built-in insect repellent. I'm all for those. So they will never have to have the fashion industry or grow any cotton. And they're not aggressive, so they will never have to have wars.
It sounds ideal, at least at some levels, but they're also, I thought, what was wonderful in Mad Adam was that the humans are irritated by them. They find them... As
you would be.
By a child, really. They're childlike, aren't they, in many ways?
Well, because we could start in the studio. What's that you're talking into? Well, what is electricity? How does it work? What do you mean somebody can hear your voice who's in a different place? What's that on your head? Why are you wearing those glass things? What is that second skin you've got on, and what's that on your wrist? They don't know any of these things. So they are constantly questioning, and they're also doing what children do once they discover the past tense and the future tense. So they have to have, where did we come from? And that results in a theology.
That's really at the centre of this book, isn't it? The arrival of literacy. Your attitude to literacy in this book is ambiguous, it seems to me, and clearly you don't have an ambiguous attitude to literacy.
I actually do.
You do?
And I think anybody who gives it lots of thought probably does. So with every human tool, you get gains, otherwise we wouldn't build and use that tool, but you also get losses. So there was quite a debate earlier on amongst the Greeks, writing things down. Does that cause you to lose your memory? And the other thing about writing things down is that the text can become ossified, so it becomes the letter rather than the spirit. And does that just stop everything dead? Do you then have a sacred text that is going to be constraining?
Yes, without giving anything away, there is at least a hint that such things might occur.
They have occurred in the past.
They have occurred in the past, indeed. So are you now finished with this trilogy completely? Do you think it's released you?
Is it finished with me?
Yeah.
I would certainly think so. But you never know because, of course, I never make predictions about the future.
You're very interested in the power of the story as well. I mean, it features, it's not only because the story is what pulls us through the whole novel, but there is a storyteller in this novel. Was that a kind of way of exploring your own kind of ambiguous feelings about telling stories?
I think we are storytellers by nature. And if you look at what children do before the age of, say, 4, they will spontaneously understand stories even before they can talk. So we come with that as part of our package, as we come with music, as we come with an interest in images. We do not come with an interest in higher mathematics and algebra. I can tell you that. We need to be taught those. But we pick up language spontaneously. We pick up stories. And I think it must be very, very old and doubtless conferred an advantage upon us. And that's one of the reasons they're interested in them, because they do have that part of our human inheritance.
Vicky Featherstone, it's a crucial element in theatre as well, isn't it? This susceptibility of the human to stories.
I mean, it absolutely fascinates me, our innate sense and our innate understanding of story. And like Margaret says, we don't have to be taught it. And again, I sit in a theatre, and the moment when the story goes slightly awry, the whole audience shift, and they know more than we do that something isn't going right with the story. I don't mean in terms of the plot, but in terms of the structure or the dramaturgy or the ordering.
You mean if
of the
somebody
story.
if the artist has made a mistake?
Yeah, if it's not all kind of firing on all cylinders and the story needs a little bit of editing or a bit of focus, the audience shift and they feel it physiologically, and that fascinates me, how deeply ingrained our understanding and need for story is.
And there's something very powerful about a single voice storyteller, isn't there, as well? Because in the novel, there are these moments where, as it were, you hear just as though you're sitting around a campfire listening to one voice. And similarly in the play, it still has a magic that all of our complicated ways of telling stories don't, or perhaps sacrifice something.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the play that Dennis has written, a big chunk of the beginning, almost the first act of the play, is narrated as the story of George Mastromus's life up until a certain point. And it's incredibly evocative, the use of language, but it is directly spoken to the audience. And I always feel very excited as an audience member when I know that the play can only exist because I'm there. And it's the conversation about the fourth wall. Fourth wall theatre is fantastic, but it can exist without the audience. So the kind of relationship in the kind of gap, if you like, between the audience and the actor on stage, where that kind of empathy is created, is the thing that makes theatre feel very alive for me. Yeah,
that's a bit of a tree falling in the forest, isn't it? I'd be interested in a fourth wall play existing without an audience entirely. Yeah. I'm sure it's been done in Edinburgh, probably. A.C. Grayling, I want to bring you in and back to the Quakers, actually. I was rather interested in the Quakers as engineered, as it were, to be benign, because it makes them amoral, doesn't it? It makes them creatures that they can't be described as virtuous, and you cut me off when I said that, because they have no capacity to do ill.
Well, or they haven't discovered it yet, perhaps.
You think it's an emergent property in humans, do you?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think it is one of those core questions. How do we tell good from evil? And at what point does that enter our consciousness?
A notion of virtue must have some sense of suppressing evil, mustn't it?
Well, I think
to operate, which the Quakers don't, in a curious way.
Human beings are essentially social creatures, and they need their relationships with one another. And those relationships matter to them so much that they begin to make decisions about who is in your sort of inner circle of concern and who's on the outer circle. In a world of the kind that Margaret has created, of course, because there are rather fewer people around, there's less opportunity for conflict. I mean, it's conflict over resources, and it's conflict over differences of ideology that cause tensions and make us think that the other is bad, evil. We've got to attack them or repulse them in some way, or feel threatened by them. And it's in there that you find the seeds, the roots of evil, because hostility and antipathy breed on those things. So in this world, you have less opportunity for it, but still this intrinsic sociality means that there is a sense of what's virtuous, what's right, what matters, expression of affection, and it also generates this sense of the other.
You've led us very neatly onto the subject of your book, which it's called simply Friendship, and is not just an intellectual history of the notion of friendship, but also an exploration of what it has meant in various different periods. Can we think historically about ethics? Isn't the point of them that they're meant to remain immutable and transcendent and overcome cultural difference?
First, we need to distinguish between ethics, that is, the consideration of what sort of people we should be and what counts as a good and flourishing life, on the one hand, and on the other hand, questions of morality, because moralities change. I mean, in the memory of many people alive today, homosexuality was a criminal offence just a generation ago in the Western countries, and that's changed. So moral attitudes can change, moral attitudes can advance, but the perennial ethical issues, that is, the attempt to respond to Socrates' question, what sort of people should we be? How should we live our lives? What values should inform and shape them? That is perennial. Now, it happens that this great discussion about friendship was started by Plato and Aristotle because they recognized that at the very heart of good lives are friendships.
When you say good lives, then, you mean both things, though, don't you? You mean not just a pleasant life, one that's pleasant for the person having it, but also a good and virtuous life, and one that's good for the society it exists within. And friendship is supposed to be some kind of purifying
Yes, indeed.
Activity.
It's certainly a very central part of it. But one thing I have to say is that, naturally enough, when people start talking about ethics and virtue, they think you're being sort of goody two-shoes. And it may be that when you reflect on ethical principles, you find that your attitude becomes very subversive of contemporary morality. Because most moral outlooks tend to cut right across the grain of human nature. They tend to be very restrictive and oppressive, especially on sexual matters, for example. And if you were to be more thoughtful about ethics, you might turn out to be, rather a revolutionary when it comes to moral matters. So that's the first thing to register. And the second thing to register is that because we are so in need of our relationships with one another, we have to think a little bit about what the most achieved of those would be. And I try to argue in the book that all our relationships, the non-elective ones, our family relationships, people that we work with, and our elective ones, the people we meet and like, and we find a sort of mutual connection arising between us. In both those cases, if we can genuinely become friends, so if you can become friends with your children when they grow up, if you can become friends with your parents when you grow up, if you can become friends with your workmates, with your lovers, with your spouse, with your whoever you encounter, that is the achievement. Making that kind of contact between two or more people where you really can be mutual, you really can trust one another, and you really feel that in the fabric of the texture of your life there is something good, which is this other person or other people.
You touch on an ambiguity that a lot of philosophers have addressed, which is whether you can be a friend to your spouse, not because you don't like your spouse or aren't attracted to her, but because, as it were, that relationship excludes friendship. Friendship is a different thing. It's a thing that exists without those ties of sexual attraction or kinship. You seem to be suggesting that's not the case, or that we've arrived at a point where that's not the case.
I am suggesting that because I think that even if you remain lovers or remain spouses or remain workmates or remain parent and child, nevertheless an element of that relationship, a really central important element of it, can grow out of it, and that element is the friendship element. Now, that invites from us anyway the question, what does that mean, and where does the difference lie? And I think Oscar Wilde really captured it. He said, a friend is a person who stabs you in the front. And I think that really gets it.
Is it necessarily exclusive? Does it have to push other people out? Because that was a source of great Christian anxiety about friendship, wasn't it? That friendship was somehow a failure of love for the entire world.
Yes, Christian moralists really did have a difficulty with this. Agape, which is a universal, undifferentiating concern for your fellow human beings, meant that you couldn't privilege one or a few of them and give them more attention than you would give anybody else. You must be like the Good Samaritan to everybody and not just to a few. And this, of course, generates conflicts. I mean, it's an unlivable demand, really, because we do need those close relationships. We do need to have people in our sphere of interest who really are such that they know a good deal about you, they accept a lot about you, they recognise your failings and forgive you for them, that you can laugh with them, you can share jokes and interests. And you can't do this with the whole world, obviously, because human nature, human beings are so diverse, there's such a great plurality of kinds of being. So the Christians did have a big problem with that, and this is exemplified by one of the best accounts of the nature of friendship, and it's in St. Augustine, in the Confessions, before he became a Christian. He had wonderful, deep friendships, and his account of the grief that he felt when he lost one of his friends is one of the most beautiful and moving things you could read. But when he became a Christian, we're only allowed to have friends if they're friends in God, and we have to remember that there is this duty on us of loving everybody.
as you say, the kind of cultural expression of friendship changes. One of the most recent is social networks, and you touch on this a little bit in your book. Are those real friends? Are they entirely fake friends, or are they something entirely novel, a friend that you never meet?
It's an interesting fact about social media that, of course, they've hugely extended the range of contacts that we can make with other people. But that's also true of air travel. It's also true of globalization in general. So we now can be in contact in different ways with many, many more people than we used to when we just lived in a village. On the whole, the vast majority of human interactions are going to be reasonably cooperative and mutual. But they're not going to be friendships until a certain amount of water has flown under the bridge of that relationship. So, of course, Facebook friends are not friends. They're not friends. I mean, you've got 500 friends on Facebook.
I wonder, Margaret Atwood, you have, 400,000 Twitter followers, I think. They can't possibly all be your friends, but there must be some within that where you get that chime of character or expression that makes you think, oh, this isn't... I mean, I know it happens to me on Twitter that there are some people you think, oh, that would be an interesting person.
Well, actually, you sometimes meet up with them, indeed. So yes, I think they're not automatically all your very best friend, but among that group, and Twitter is a self-selecting thing. People don't bother looking at what you have to say unless they feel something mutual is happening. So indeed, I have met some of the Twitter pals and even done some events for them over time.
And do you think of them as friends before you actually meet them, or is that a necessary
condition?
Well,
I think of them as a sort of big collective, and at my age, a big collective grandchild.
Yeah, that's a very different relationship, isn't it?
Yeah, somewhat. But I have friendly feelings towards them. They're actually pretty jolly, and they if you pose them, for instance, a verbal conundrum or a puzzle, they will leap enthusiastically in and start contributing quite often quite funny things.
Vicky Featherstone, you use Twitter as well,
yes, I do,
think.
yes.
But do you think of any of those people as friends, or?
I mean, some of them are my friends that I connect with through Twitter, but I think of them as a like-minded tribe in a way, and I'm able to connect with people through that would take me years to find or speak to. So my sort of relationship with Twitter is something which keeps me alert and on my toes and kind of endlessly thrilled by the amount of sort of imagination and discussion that goes on there. So I have a really positive relationship with it.
It's possibly... people on Twitter, I mean, apart from the trolls, are too cautious, I think, to be good friends, aren't they? Because one quality of a friend, as you said, is the person who will come to you and say, I'm sorry, but you're not behaving well. Nobody else will tell you this, but I will.
That.
They will they?
Oh, they let you know.
Just to come back to you, Anthony, I wanted to ask a little bit about why you hadn't done any prehistory of friendship. You touched very briefly on it, and Margaret has briefly kind of talked about the evolutionary advantages of friendship, but you don't go into that much. It's not a prehistory of friendship, it's mostly about what people have thought, as it were, a literate kind of...
Indeed. Well, it's not about the biology of it, but the fact is that, thinking carefully about the nature of this relationship really, really starts with Aristotle. And by the way, the Nicomachean Ethics is a book that anybody could read in the bath. It's very accessible if you are prepared to pay it a bit of attention. So, philosophy frightens people away, but this shouldn't. And he really got this discussion going, which has gone on right the way through the tradition of thought up until our own time. But it's slightly skewed it in two ways. One is that Aristotle has in the Ethics a little throwaway remark in which he says, a friend is another self. And this trope was picked up again and again and again all the way through, except by people like Cicero and Augustine and Francis Bacon, leaping across the centuries there. But they were a bit more astute, a bit more common sense about this than I think that remark implies. But it was picked up in the Renaissance, for example. There were many, many books of friendship, and they all repeat this view. And of course it's wrong, because you shouldn't think of a friend as another self. You should honour the difference and see them as having the space around them where their interests, their needs, their desires might not always accord with yours. And an act of genuine friendship towards them is the embracing of that and the acceptance of that. That, I think, is terribly important. And so what I had to do in the book was somewhat unravel this the steer that Aristotle had given the debate.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of people take it up. Cicero had this notion of absolute equality. He has this line, if his friend be rich, he is not poor. Yeah. And I thought, well, actually, that's not true of real friendships, is it? If his friend be rich, he might feel even poorer. But live with that fact and, suppress his envy.
And there is one other way in which the debate about friendship has been skewed, and that is that in legend and literature, the examples of great friendships between Achilles and Patroclus, between Jonathan and David, between Nisus and Euryalus, all these many examples, they're all mainly male examples, of course, except for Ruth and Naomi. And this is because of the suppressed voice of women in history and in literature. But these examples of friendships are as much examples of great love affairs as they are of friendships. And so when one thinks about what the tradition, the classical view of friendship really means, are we looking at friendship, the sort of gut thing that we feel about friendship, or are we looking at a certain kind of homoerotic as opposed to homosocial relationship? And that also has distorted it a bit.
Well, it raises those two questions. I mean, I don't know what you think of this, Margaret Atwood. I mean, there are two questions. One, can men and women be friends with the presence of a kind of sexual desire always hovering there potentially? And are women's friendships different to men's friendships?
Okay, men and women can absolutely be friends. And it needn't involve sexual hoverings of any kind. Although a certain amount of joking can be involved.
So you can flirt, but nothing more.
Well, in a kind of silly kind of way.
I would think that very dangerous.
Not at my age, it's not dangerous.
And women's friendships?
Women's friendships, I would think if you look at I was very interested in your play moment when the young boy has a really close friend and everybody admires this really close friend, and then the fate of the really close friend begins to turn, and instead of being an in-group person, he becomes an out-group person. And there's a moment in which he goes to our hero and says, basically, will you still be my friend? And the hero faithfully says yes, which means a big downturn in his fortunes. And that is very typical of little boys, hierarchies and who's at the top and who you're looking up to and who you're looking down on. I think little girls are much more Byzantine. In that the popularity moves around, but it's not the result of a fight. It's not the result of somebody winning a fight. It is unpredictable and much more like the Tudor court.
Because the feelings evoked when children have no sort of filter in terms of their response to their friendships, they look like they're in love with each other. They behave like they're in love with each other. The kind of the part in the story that you're talking about, Margaret, the way that that's described and the language that's is used is that he's in love with this boy, Paul, the way that he looks, his kind of curly hair and his deep eyes.
And I think that's true.
Yeah, I think that's something as well. It's an interesting thing when at some point that feeling has to be sort of diluted in some way because it's overpowering, and we have to kind of redefine what friendships are as we become older, and that can become complex. But I think the feeling that's evoked is very much a feeling of kind of sexless love, if you like.
Well, or even more ambiguous than that. I was reading your book, Anthony, at the same time as A History of the American Civil War, and James Garfield, later president, was writing a letter of such passionate intensity to a male friend. Not in our terms a homosexual kind of friend, but, I wish to lay all night in your arms. And no inhibition about the expression of that. Which is something you touch on that, as it were, habits change about how men can express friendship to men.
Indeed. One example I cite is Tennyson and Hallam. And when Tennyson in Memoriam writes about what he felt about Hallam and how he misses him now, he writes as if he were his lover, and indeed he writes almost as if he were a female lover of Hallam. Now, Hallam was affianced to his sister, so they were heterosexuals. There was no other sort of implication there. People always want to find it and suspect it, but in that kind of writing, in those very, very deep and passionate friendships, the natural way to express it is in these loving terms, in terms of very, very deep affection and attachment.
But does that not mean that implicitly a friendship is love with a limit? It's love and it says it stops at this point. Whatever that point might be, it might because your love for a child would be different.
Providing one remembers that the word love is a very capacious word. I mean, it's a baggy concept, and there are lots of different ways of loving. You love your children, you love your parents, you might love your workmates when you've been through a difficult time with them. But to love your friends, well, that doesn't have to have all the implications that loving one special other of the opposite or same sex, depending on your sexuality, might have. You spoke there about the added dimension that sex brings into things. Nowadays, in our much, much more open attitude towards relationships, we talk about friends with benefits, even though we do have a slight anxiety about whether that might not end up in a worse kind of enmity than just between two.
It's a kind of euphemism, isn't it?
It is a bit of a euphemism. Yes, it is a bit. But it has a certain mileage in it. And I think it captures something about the fact that if we're less anxious and concerned about the nature of sex, if there are fewer barriers around it, it might turn out indeed that there are young people who think that sex is just a fairly normal part of a friendship, and it doesn't imply something final or absolute.
I won't be holding my breath for that, I don't think. Vicky Featherstone, I want to turn to your play, because your play is all about betrayals, among other things. The Ritual Slaughter of George Mastromas. An unusual play. As I said at the beginning, it's narrated, it's presented. I think you were originally going to call it The Ballad of George Mastromas. What did you mean? What was the word ballad doing?
I just have to be very clear that I would love it dearly to be my play, but
I'm
not the voice, as in kind of Anthony
you're
and
directing
Margaret.
It, yeah.
Yes, I'm interpreting
Dennis
Kelly's play. So my role is to kind of bring it to life, if you like. Yes, I mean, fundamentally, it's about a story. It's about a group of people gathered to tell a story. So at one point, Dennis wondered whether to call it a ballad, but realised Ritual Slaughter was much more exciting as a title. But the story, it's so kind of apposite in terms of the conversation that we've been having. The story is about a boy called George, and it goes from his conception to a moment up into the future. And it's the story of a boy who is deeply ordinary and who makes all apparently the right choices, the good moral choices.
Yes, he's not ordinary in that respect, is he? Because, to take a slightly cynical view of human
that's
nature.
Right. And this whole first section, this whole kind of narrated section, talks about his kind of early years, and there are three kind of loves that are in it: a childish love, an adolescent love, and an adult love. And at each point, he has a huge decision to make. Does he go with Paul, who is now kind of fallen from grace, or does he go with the cool boys? Does he kiss the girl? And could he have a fantastic life going off to Europe and having a kind of wonderful sort of romantic vision with her? And does he persuade the girl that he's got pregnant by mistake to have an abortion so he can go back to his girlfriend who he loves? And he makes apparently the right choice each time, but it gets to a point in the play when he starts to question whether or not that choice is about goodness or actually cowardice, because it's
this
got
phrase
nowhere.
runs through, doesn't it, like a litany?
That's right.
Was it goodness or cowardice?
Was it goodness or cowardice? So when you first read it, you think, well, obviously it's goodness, because the opposite of that is evil, and therefore he's not making an evil choice. Or is it cowardice? And somebody offers him the keys to the kingdom and says, you can be powerful, you can have everything you want, you can leave all that behind, and you can become successful if you start to behave in a certain way. And because he's never got anywhere by being ordinary, he chooses to kind of, make that pact, really. And his life changes overnight because he has these 3 golden rules, which are, whenever you want something, take it. All that's required to get something is to lie to the bottom of your heart and never, ever regret, never worry about the outcome. And he becomes amoral as a result of that.
I noticed that Ayn Rand gets a little name check
right
at the beginning. It's a very Ayn Randian philosophy, isn't it?
What Dennis is playing with in the play is the idea of a generation that was born in the kind of early 70s up until now, has followed a kind of moment of wonderful, warm sort of summers of growing up, to a kind of period in the 80s when political creed was vital, to the 90s when that was thrown out of the window, and it wasn't even about capitalism anymore, it was about power, and power that wasn't even connected to politics, and then the kind of collapse of that, and where's that left us? So George follows that, but in getting everything, he also has to question whether or not that's been successful or not.
It's very conspicuously a parable, this. Is that, I should say as well, it's very funny. It's not at all pious as a parable.
No, I don't know if it is a parable. I'm very interested in the kind of difference between, and I was going to ask Anthony anyway, in his wisdom, and he's already talked about it, the difference between morality and ethics, because I don't think it is a parable. I don't think it's about morality. I think it's about putting an ambiguous set of choices on stage that we enter into and ask the question of, would we have done the same thing?
Of course, what you want in the world may not turn out to be what you think you want in the world. That's another of the problems, isn't it?
It is. Well, Somerset Maugham famously said it's everybody's tragedy to get what they want in the end, if they want it hard enough. And wanting it hard enough is what would lead you to do these things. And of course, there is this the aspect of dilemma about it. And remember that dilemmas in the ethical debate are always where there are quite strong arguments on both sides, which is why it's really hard to choose. And the idea of living a life which feels good to live, a life which is worthwhile and flourishing from one's own point of view, is a very attractive thing. And it may very well be that one has a duty to seek that kind of life, especially if you achieve it, then you can be all the better for other people. The impact on your lives for other people can be better. But at what kind of cost, and at the disruption of what kind of principle? Because if you did it by harming other people, by treading on their heads, by disadvantaging them, then this big question arises. Surely the mutual need that we have for one another, the kinds of connections within social groups and society as a whole, on which the well-functioning, even of oneself in the end, depends. Wouldn't even the most self-interested person recognise that they have to be altruistic to some extent?
I mean, it's one of George's problems, isn't it? He's undone by a sudden, he's hit by something that isn't self-interested.
And also, the course, the problem for George is that the thing that he wants is love and is a person. So he's incredibly successful in terms of business and ownership and all of those kind of things. But the thing that, and he treats somebody so unbelievably, shockingly badly. It's horrific to watch, but is ultimately undone by that.
Can I ask you, it's something, it's going back to something about the dystopia, that there is, as well as our appetite for story, there is in us an appetite to see the worst. Dystopias feed it. Also scenes like some of those in the play feed it. That there is within us a little thin shiver of thrill at seeing the worst done and somebody getting away with it.
I think that's what kind of fiction, whether it's fiction in the theatre or in books, exists for, that somebody else goes to the furthest place for us, that we don't have to experience that kind of almost sociopathic behaviour ourselves, and that we kind of witness it and understand something from it.
Do you agree, Margaret? Well,
this kind of story has always been with us. And it is what, for instance, makes Richard III so watchable. He comes on at the beginning and says, "I'm really bad. And I'm telling you that right now, and now watch what I'm going to do." So there is that. I think there is that, and we do have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was right. We do have that other person within us that sees the possibilities. What happened if I did that? And then we can actually listen in on ourselves calculating, if I heaved a brick through the window, it would be lots of fun, but would I get away with it?
But is it necessary it's not always necessary for the story itself to wag a finger at you, is it? Those stories must operate in part because we see ourselves at our worst, and conscience does. You're looking sceptical.
Very, very few people will look in the mirror every day and say, "I'm an entirely good and virtuous person all the time."
I'm sure that we do sometimes see on stage or in a novel something that makes us wince about ourselves, yes. But I think much more, theatre and literature in general offers us laboratories, safe from the point of view of the audience in the theatre or the reader of the novel, but laboratories where experiments in human living and human experience can be conducted and explored. And this is the wonderful thing about them. We love stories. We love them for many different reasons. We have this narrative desire because we like structure, things with a beginning, a middle and an end. But we also like the fact that they gossip to us about what other people think and feel and do, and we can learn something from that. But they also offer us an opportunity to see what would happen if I were in that position, or if the world were like that, then we can see how things work out.
Aren't they experiments with fudged results, though? I'm not saying that as a bad thing. You have to create them. You have to finish the story off, but you basically have to write the result. And you write very often the result that you want, not the one that you don't. I'm sure a paid-up, right-wing Republican might well come to this play and say, "Oh, it's terrible liberal prejudice, it doesn't all go wrong. It's all for the best if we all behave like that."
Although the end of the play is genuinely complex because it's called The Ritual Slaughter of George Nostromus. So in a way he's become a victim of the success that he's been offered. So he doesn't end up bad, if you like. And so it's much more complex than that. And I think what you want is a kind of, Andrew Marvell leaving the audience kind of trailing clouds of glory of the ideas of the play. You don't want it to kind of end and stop. You want there to be left something which kind of continues in them as a question.
I think Margaret got it at the end of Oryx and Crake,
Yeah.
leaving it open-ended, because if we, the reader or the viewer, the audience, if we can supply endings or speculate on what they might be or what the alternatives might be, we get a lot more out of it than being told what the ending is.
Well, you left it open-ended and then you came back, but I think you've left this one open-ended too. I like the
Somewhat,
ending very much.
Thank you, but we're not going to talk about the ending.
No, I'm not.
we?
I don't want to give it
No.
away at all, I promise you, but it seems to me that you close the book and you don't think, oh, well, that's done and I move on to something else. You think, I wonder what's going to happen next.
True, but you know, readers are intelligent people, and reading is a very interactive thing. So whether you, author, tell the reader this is how it happens or not, the reader will have other views. Mm-hmm. They may say this is just a lot of rubbish and they never would have ended up that way. Or they might indeed say, well, I wouldn't have made that choice.
Vicky Featherstone, you hinted that the theatre audience does that too. I mean, you were talking about how they're very alert to things going wrong in the structure. You've been doing a lot at the Royal Court to kind of open up the building, to change the nature of it. Roughly, what are you wanting to do with it? I mean, I want a kind of position paper, just very briefly.
I mean, I think that the sort of shared act of sitting in a theatre is the kind of community of that, the congregation of that is an extraordinary feeling, and kind of witnessing that together. And I think that everyone should be able to have that.
Do you ever get moments, though, when you go to the theatre and think, oh, this has turned really pernicious? I certainly have. I've sat in the National Theatre and thought, oh, this is an audience completely complacent with its own views. It's seeing them reflected back to them. It's applauding its own sort of moral sensibility. I mean, that can happen as well in a theatre.
No, I mean, that happens hugely. And in a way, I think my sort of desire to make theatre is a kind of reaction to that. It's always been about, you know, theatre is a place where certain artists take certain questions and certain ideas about the world and find a way to kind of develop them into something that can challenge us and make us see things differently. And, you know, that's the kind of art form that I've ended up in. But for me, I think that the theatre architecture is an interesting thing, because I think people decide whether or not they're the kind of person that feels confident about going through the doors of that actual building. And I think often artistic directors are trying to persuade other people who don't feel comfortable with that architecture to go through the building.
Well, you've already opened a lot of other doors. Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about that because we've run out of time now. Thank you to all my guests. Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam is out now. A.C Grayling's book on friendship will be published later this month. And Vicky Featherstone's directorial debut, The Ritual Slaughter of George Mastromas, continues at the Royal Court Theatre in London until mid-October. Next week, Stephanie Flanders will be here looking at the impact of new technology on teenagers who've never known life without a smartphone, with Beeban Kidron, Farida Viss and Adrian Hon. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
A and B rather than these other two terms, or we could call them, you know, apples and oranges. But there is a difference between a story set in a galaxy far, far away and in another time, and a story set on our planet that could conceivably happen because we've got all the tools for it. And I think our approach to those stories as readers is quite different. If I want total escape, I go off to see Star Wars. I may find out some things about human nature because you can't make a narrative story. As a human being, you cannot make a story without saying things about human nature, even if your protagonists are rabbits. But I think there is a difference if you know it might actually be possible. So 1984, let's call that a carrot. War of the Worlds, let's call that a tomato.
Yes, I mean, it's kind of extrapolative fiction, isn't it? You're following a road into the future and kind of building it out.
If you don't like this road, don't go down it, more or less like that. So who was this person, we find out, and we also find out about his group of bioresistance activists and what happens to all of them when they find themselves together, the plague having swept away quite a bit of humanity, but leaving the genetically modified, very good-looking but innocent Quakers.
And a handful of ungenetically modified
handful of ungenetically modified humans, which would include the original Jimmy the Snowman, shepherd of the Quakers, the remnants of the Gods' Gardeners, and the Mad Adamites now assembled.
I want to ask you a question which you've been asked a lot and you're probably bored of answering it, but I think people who haven't heard the answer will be interested in it. You have made the distinction between science fiction and speculative fiction. That was misunderstood at one point, as though you were looking down on science fiction, which I don't think is true, but you very firmly say this is speculative fiction. What's the difference in your mind?
It's just a question of what label is on the box. So we could call them
Thank you for downloading this edition of Radio 4's Start the Week, presented by me, Stephanie Flanders.
Hello. There are circumstances in which the pursuit of a virtuous life can seem like a luxury. The small band of human survivors who've made it through to the final volume of Margaret Atwood's dystopian trilogy about a plague-blasted world simply want to stay safely clear of the pigoons and the paintballers. But even they can't suppress the old human instincts for love and friendship and the altruism that comes with them. Do their associates really count as friends, though, in a world where you don't get much choice about who you spend time with if you want to stay alive? The writer A.C Grayling may have a view on this. He's just about to publish an exploration of our ideas of friendship across the century, the first in a new series of monographs on vices and virtues. And Vicky Featherstone, the new artistic director of the Royal Court Theatre in London, has also been thinking about the obligations and burdens of friendship as she works on her first production for the Royal Court, a moral fable about the rewards of ruthlessness and the hazards of ruth. Dennis Kelly's The Ritual Slaughter of George Mastromas. We start, though, with Margaret Atwood, a writer who's always been thrillingly indifferent to the conventional fence lines of literary form and genre. She's written poetry, novels, historical essays, online collaborative fiction, librettos. She's even embraced that newest kind of short-form publication, the tweet. But she's surely best known for her novels, from The Handmaid's Tale and the Booker-winning The Blind Assassin to her latest book, Mad Adam, the last of a trilogy about a post-apocalyptic world populated by genetic chimeras. Margaret Atwood, when you wrote the first of that trilogy, Oryx and Crake, did you know how long you were going to stay in the world that you'd created?
No idea.
So
no,
what was it? Why did you not get the exit visa after the first book?
Well, the first one ends on an open-ended cliffhanger, which at which point we hope the reader will think, well, what would I do? Would I shoot the remaining human beings as hazardous aggressors, or would I make friends with them? Would I offer them friendship? Would they reciprocate? And we actually don't know the answer to that. So I did want to know the answer, and in order to do that, of course, I had to write 2 more books.
You had to write 2 more. Why 2?
Well, there were 2 stories. And the one in the second book follows a group of pacifist, vegetarian, unless you're really hungry, religious cultists cultivating vegetables and raising bees on rooftops and slums and what happens to them. The third book follows the more resistance-prone group of mad Adamites named after originally an online game called Extinctathon, which is run by a grandmaster called Mad Adam. Adam named the animals. Mad Adam names the dead ones want to play.